The rain in Seattle did not fall. It pressed. It pressed against glass, against concrete, against every living thing until the whole city seemed to sag under its weight. From the back seat of his Maybach, Nathaniel Harrington watched the skyline blur into a smear of gray and silver. Towers that once stood like monuments to ambition now looked like gravestones, cold, wet, and fading in the distance. Each streak of water on the tinted glass was another reminder of how far he had fallen, how fast the ground could disappear beneath a man who once thought he was untouchable. The leather interior smelled of wealth, polished wood, custom stitching, a whisper of cologne that clung to the suit he hadn't bothered to change in 2 days. But even here, cocooned in a vehicle that screamed power, he felt small, a king without a throne. The city outside pulsed with life, yet he sat hollow, as if the rain had washed not just the streets but his very soul. His hand moved slowly over the window, tracing a drop of water as it slid down. It felt like time slipping, mocking him with every second. He had built Harrington Innovations from nothing, his garage filled with soldered circuits, sleepless nights, a dream so wild it nearly broke him. And for what? To watch it bleed out, from the inside because of one man. Gideon Vance. A name Nathaniel could no longer speak without feeling fire rise in his throat. Protégé, partner, friend, now traitor. Gideon hadn't just stolen secrets, he had stolen trust. And trust was a currency far rarer than the billions that filled Harrington's accounts. Nathaniel leaned back, the rain's dull percussion like a funeral march on the roof of the Maybach. For years his name had been whispered in boardrooms, not as a man but as a legend. Ambition carved into flesh, determination in a tailored suit. He had been the man who never blinked, who always pushed further, who turned impossible into inevitable. Now he felt like a ghost trapped in a body that refused to fight. Frank, his driver of 15 years, glanced at him in the mirror. The older, man's eyes carried quiet concern, but Nathaniel didn't want pity. He didn't want anything, not anymore. He shook his head and looked back at the rain, as though it could offer an answer. But all it offered was reflection, his own face older than he remembered. Tired lines carved deep around eyes that had once burned with fire. It wasn't the loss of money that hollowed him out. Money was recoverable. It was the loss of something far crueler. The betrayal had carved a hollow in his chest, and the silence inside that hollow grew louder each day. He felt it when he woke in his penthouse, surrounded by marble and glass but choking on emptiness. He felt it when he walked through his offices, employees stepping aside like he was a relic passing. He felt it in the mirror every morning, the spark gone, replaced by a man barely clinging to relevance. Outside, Seattle glistened under the storm. Every light fractured into broken shards across the wet pavement. The city seemed to mock him. Alive, breathing, unbothered by the fact that one of its most powerful suns was unraveling in silence. Nathaniel Harrington pressed his palms together, his breath heavy. "What am I even doing anymore?" he whispered, though no one answered. The Maybach hummed, the world passed by, and the rain kept falling. A relentless reminder that even empires dissolve when the fire within begins to die. And in that silence, in that storm, Nathaniel Harrington, the man, who once believed ambition could conquer anything, felt the terrifying truth he was slipping. And unless something or someone pulled him out, he would be lost forever. The Maybach slowed as the city blurred into streaks of neon and wet asphalt. Nathaniel's voice broke the hush inside the car, low and flat, as if every syllable cost him something. "Just pull over, Frank, anywhere, I don't care where." Frank's brows lifted in the rearview mirror. He had seen his boss close billion-dollar deals with a smile, command rooms filled with world leaders, walk through storms of chaos without flinching. But tonight, Nathaniel Harrington sounded like a man who had misplaced his own shadow. "Sir, I can have something delivered to the penthouse in 20 minutes. 5-star, anything you want." Nathaniel let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "I don't want 5 stars. I want coffee, bad coffee, the kind that tastes like regret. Seems fitting." Frank hesitated, his fingers tightening slightly on the steering wheel. Then he gave a single nod. The car glided through slick streets before rolling to a stop in front of a flickering neon sign. The P and Blue Plate diner had gone dark, leaving it to glow late diner against the rain. Nathaniel stared at it for a moment, almost smirking. Late indeed for his career, his trust, his fire. He ignored the umbrella Frank offered and stepped into the storm. The cold slapped him, soaking his suit within seconds, plastering dark strands of silver-streaked hair against his forehead. The rain felt like judgment, each drop heavier than it should be, as though the sky itself wanted to remind him he wasn't in control anymore. The diner door groaned when he pushed it open. The first thing that hit him was the smell, a pungent cocktail of burnt grease, old coffee, and bleach. It clung to the air like a story that refused to end. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed with an unsteady hum, bathing cracked vinyl booths, and chipped tabletops in a pale, almost sickly glow. A handful of souls scattered the room. 2 truckers leaned into their mugs of coffee, muttering about fuel prices. A student sat hunched over a textbook, highlighter moving furiously as if trying to fight back exhaustion with neon ink. And near the window sat a woman, her face turned outward, eyes lost in a storm of her own. Nathaniel slid into a booth by the window, the vinyl biting cold against his expensive suit. He felt every eye notice him, even if they didn't linger. A billionaire in a place like this was as out of place as a diamond ring in a junk drawer. He belonged nowhere. And somehow that truth fit. The waitress appeared, her footsteps dragging with exhaustion. She looked to be in her late 20s, hair pulled back into a messy ponytail, strands slipping loose to frame a face carved by weariness. Her uniform, a faded blue dress with a white apron, was clean but tired. A name tag rested above her chest. "Eliza. What can I get you?" she asked, her voice soft, clear, but stripped of the fake cheerfulness that servers often put on like armor. "Coffee. Black." Nathaniel's eyes drifted back to the rain-streaked window. She gave a small nod, no judgment in her gaze, no attempt at small talk. Minutes later, she returned with a thick white mug, steam rising in lazy curls. The smell was bitter, uninspired, exactly what he wanted. He took a sip and almost laughed. Perfect. The rain drummed against the window, a rhythm that synced with the ache inside him. He sat in silence, letting the diner's pathetic ambiance wash over him. The sizzle of bacon on the grill, the hum of lights, the quiet scrape of pens and forks. Each sound belonged to people simply trying to make it through another day. He looked at them, the cook flipping pancakes with practiced ease, the truckers locked in their small world of survival, the student fighting fatigue. And finally he looked at Eliza. She moved with precision born of necessity, refilling mugs, clearing plates, never wasting motion. But in the rare pauses, she leaned against the counter, pulled a cheap pen from her apron, and reached for a napkin. Nathaniel almost looked away until he saw her hand move. It wasn't idle doodling, it wasn't boredom, it was deliberate, careful, lines intersecting with purpose, circles, arcs, annotations in the margins. He narrowed his eyes, the old fire stirring, however faint. He knew that language. For the first time in months, Nathaniel Harrington leaned forward in his seat. The coffee forgotten, the rain outside fading to a distant murmur. Something was happening at that counter. Something he could feel in his bones. A waitress, a pen, and a napkin. And in that fragile combination, he saw a flicker of possibility. Something that might just be enough to pull him out of the grave he had been digging for himself. Eliza moved like someone who had long ago accepted exhaustion as part of her skin. She wove between tables with a grace born not of energy, but of repetition. Each refill, each plate cleared, another mark on a shift that seemed endless. To the truckers, she was a server. To the student, just a hand delivering caffeine, to most invisible. But Nathaniel Harrington was watching her as though she were a cipher he couldn't yet crack. There was something in the way her eyes lingered when she paused. Sharp, intelligent, moss-green eyes that seemed older than the rest of her face. They caught light differently, almost glowing in the sterile wash of the fluorescent bulbs. He recognized that look. It was the same one he'd seen in mirrors years ago, when his mind was consumed not with balance sheets or legal battles, but with raw equations and unfinished designs, the look of someone living in two places at once, the present and the possibility. She came to his booth again, the pot in her hand half empty. "Refill?" she asked. He slid his mug forward. "Sure." The coffee splashed in, dark and bitter. She didn't smile, didn't perform for a tip, just a quiet nod, then she moved on. Her absence left a strange weight at the table, like he'd lost the thread of something he hadn't realized he was following. Nathaniel's gaze shifted back to the counter. Eliza had claimed a moment of pause. She smoothed the napkin flat on, the stainless steel surface pen in hand, brow furrowed. And there it was again, the deliberate strokes, not idle doodles. Lines intersecting at sharp angles, circles stacked like geological layers, strange symbols annotating the edges. At first glance, it looked like chaos. But to Nathaniel, who had lived his life in blueprints and schematics, the shapes hummed with meaning. It was process, not art. Flow, not decoration. He leaned slightly forward, his breath shallow, caught by the haunting familiarity of it. He saw her pause, pen hovering. Her lips moved silently, counting, recalculating. Then she added a spiral that cut through the circles like a drill biting through earth, annotating with figures so exact it made his pulse quicken. This wasn't a shopping list. This wasn't daydream scribbling. This was engineering. A flicker stirred in his chest, fragile but undeniable. It was the ghost of the old Nathaniel, the builder, the dreamer, the man who once tore through the night with solder burns on his hands and adrenaline in his veins. He hadn't felt that spark in months, maybe years. The cook shouted, "Order, up." The spell broke. Eliza snapped the napkin shut, folding it quickly, tucking it into the pocket of her apron before sliding plates onto her arms. She moved away, back into the routine of greasy spoons and heavy steps, leaving Nathaniel stunned in his booth. His coffee cooled in front of him. He didn't touch it. He couldn't. His mind was racing too fast. What had he just seen? He pressed, his hand flat against the table, grounding himself. It couldn't be what he thought. She was a waitress. Just a waitress. But those equations, those spirals and annotations, they belonged to a language few even knew how to speak. And she spoke it fluently, on a napkin. Nathaniel Harrington sat back, his pulse pounding. For the first time in months, the rain outside no longer felt like a dirge. It felt like a drumbeat. Something was happening here. Something unexpected. And for a man who had lost everything, that single fragile thread of possibility was enough to make him hold his breath, waiting for the next moment. Nathaniel's eyes returned again and again to that pocket where she had tucked the napkin. It was ridiculous, he told himself. It was a scrap of paper stained with coffee rings and grease, not the key to anything. But he couldn't unsee the precision of her strokes, the way her pen moved with intention, like someone channeling years of thought into fragile lines. He sat back in the booth, the cracked vinyl groaning beneath him, and studied her as if she were another problem to solve. Every time she thought no one was looking, her hand found the pen. Her gaze grew distant, and she returned to the napkin. The world around her, the sizzling bacon, the chatter of truckers, the hum of fluorescent lights, faded into irrelevance. She was somewhere else, somewhere deep, and he knew that place. He had lived there himself once when the world outside dissolved and the only thing that mattered was the vision in his head, waiting to be carved into reality. It wasn't boredom, driving her. It was obsession. His coffee had gone cold by the time he leaned forward, straining to catch another glimpse of her work. She had unfolded the napkin again, her hand steady despite the fatigue etched into her features. She drew concentric circles, careful arcs connecting them, tiny glyphs scribbled at intersections. He recognized geological notations, pressure, ratings, temperature gradients, the sort of figures that whispered about forces buried miles beneath the earth. It wasn't a doodle. It was a schematic. The realization hit him like a jolt of electricity. He wasn't just seeing someone pass the time between orders. He was witnessing an idea, a big one, hidden in plain sight on a napkin. His pulse quickened, his mind sparking, awake in a way it hadn't in months. What was she doing? Modeling geothermal flows, mapping lithospheric strata? His thoughts raced, tumbling over themselves, trying to piece together the fragments he had seen. She tapped the pen against a point on the napkin, lips moving silently as though she were arguing with herself. Then she drew a spiral that plunged inward, annotating it with precise figures. Nathaniel's breath caught. The numbers were too high for oil, too exact for natural gas. No, this was deeper, hotter, something few dared to even attempt. A rush of adrenaline surged through him, clearing the fog that betrayal and bitterness had left behind. He leaned back, trying to mask the intensity in his gaze, but inside, the pilot light that had almost died was suddenly alive again. The cook's shout cut through the air. "Order up!" And just like that, the spell shattered. Eliza blinked, folded the napkin with quick, practiced fingers, and slipped it back into her apron. She moved to collect the plates, sliding back into the rhythm of her shift, as if she hadn't just pulled a thread of the future out of her pocket and sketched it in blue ink. Nathaniel sat frozen, watching her. The rain outside tapped insistently on the glass as though urging him to act. He should ignore it. He should finish his coffee, leave a tip, and go back to his empty penthouse. But he couldn't. Something about that napkin refused to let him go. For the first time in months, Nathaniel Harrington wasn't thinking about loss or betrayal. He was thinking about possibility. A waitress, a pen, a napkin, and a secret that might just be worth millions. And he knew, with the kind of certainty that came only a few times in life, that he couldn't let her walk out that door without finding out what she had drawn. Nathaniel's fingers drummed restlessly against the cold tabletop, his gaze never straying far from Eliza as she moved about the diner. He told himself to let it go, to leave this place of cracked linoleum floors and buzzing lights and return to the world where he belonged, the one of towers and boardrooms, of private jets and calculated risks. But something in his chest burned. Too hot to ignore. The napkin had stirred him. No, not stirred, ignited. For months he had been drifting, sleepwalking through meetings and lawsuits, watching the empire he built corrode beneath him. But the shapes he had seen, those spirals, those annotated gradients, were not idle thoughts. They were the fingerprints of brilliance. And brilliance was something he recognized like instinct, the way a musician hears a note out of place or a thief smells opportunity in the air. He knew engineering. He knew the language of innovation. Those numbers, those calculations scribbled with a diner's pen on a flimsy napkin, they whispered of geothermal pressure, of heat transfer, of seismic resonance. This wasn't a school project or a game. It was a map to something dangerous, something powerful, something extraordinary. His mind sprinted. Could she even know what she was holding? Or was she simply the vessel, a daughter carrying the ghost of some genius past? Whoever she was not ordinary. And Nathaniel Harrington, despite his ruin, still had the instincts of a hunter. He could sense it. That napkin was worth more than the diner, more than this entire block, maybe more than anything in his vaults. He leaned back, his heart thudding in a rhythm he hadn't felt since his 20s, back when the world was still. Clay in his hands. He remembered those early years, sleeping in his garage, soldering boards until his hands blistered, chasing a dream no one believed in but him. He had tasted that wild hunger then. Now, sitting in this run-down diner, watching a weary waitress tuck a miracle into her apron pocket, he tasted it again. She walked past him, balancing plates on her arm with practiced ease. For a moment, her sleeve brushed the edge of his booth, and he caught a glimpse of the napkin peeking from her pocket. His pulse quickened. It was there, within reach, and yet untouchable. The weight of it pressed against him like a living thing, daring him to make a move. The old Nathaniel would have acted without hesitation. He would have bought the diner on the spot, fired every soul inside, and taken her into his orbit whether she wanted it or not. But that man had been tempered by betrayal, by the sting of misplaced trust. Gideon's face still haunted him, the smirk of a man who had taken everything and left Nathaniel hollow. He could not repeat that mistake. He could not lunge. Not yet. Still, his mind buzzed with recognition, the concentric circles, lithospheric layers. The spirals, resonance pathways, the annotations, pressure and temperature data. It wasn't theoretical fluff. It was a system, a model for harnessing energy at a scale no one dared attempt. The kind of idea that could shift industries, even nations. He pressed his hand to the table, grounding himself. He had to be careful. Too much urgency and she'd vanish like smoke. Too little, and the chance of a lifetime would walk out the door with her at the end of her shift. Nathaniel's lips curved, almost against his will. For the first time in half a year, he was no longer thinking about loss or betrayal. He was thinking about creation, about the thrill of building something that no one else dared dream. The fire that had nearly gone out inside him was flickering back to life. The rain hammered harder against the window, as though echoing the drum of his heartbeat. He sat up straighter, his decision made. Whatever it took, he would not let Eliza and her napkin slip away into the night. This was not chance. This was fate tapping him on the shoulder. And Nathaniel Harrington, for all his flaws, had never been a man to ignore fate when it called. When the clock above the counter ticked past 4, the diner began to thin. The truckers paid their bills, the student closed her book, and the cook leaned against the griddle with his arms folded, waiting for the last orders to die out. Nathaniel never moved from his booth. He sat perfectly still, his untouched second cup of coffee cooling beside him, eyes fixed on the one person who hadn't slowed, the waitress with the napkin in her pocket. Eliza untied her apron, folded it neatly, and hooked it on the wall. She slipped into a worn jacket that had seen too many winters and picked up her bag. The exhaustion in her movements was unmistakable, but beneath it, Nathaniel caught something else. Determination. The kind that bends but does not break. She whispered something to the night manager, nodded, and pushed open the door. The rain had not let up. If anything, it fell harder now, needling into the empty streets. Nathaniel rose, tossing a $100 bill onto the table without a glance. He ignored Frank's concerned look from the Maybach and stepped into the downpour. The water plastered his hair to his forehead, soaking his suit within seconds, but he didn't care. His eyes locked on Eliza's figure moving down the street, her head bent against the storm. "Excuse me." His voice cut through the rain, louder than he intended. She stopped instantly. Her hand went to her jacket pocket as though protecting the napkin. She turned slowly, suspicion sharpening her tired features. In the pale light of a street lamp, Nathaniel saw her face clearly for the first time. Not just weary, but guarded. A woman accustomed to defending herself from disappointment, from strangers, from life itself. "Do I know you?" she asked, her tone flat, almost cold. She shifted her weight like someone ready to run. Nathaniel raised a hand, realizing too, late how absurd his approach must look. A soaked billionaire chasing a waitress down a wet street at dawn. "No," he said, trying to soften his voice. "My name is Nathaniel Harrington." Recognition flickered across her eyes, followed by a stiffening of her shoulders. Of course she knew the name. Everyone in Seattle did. His buildings lined the skyline. His face appeared in newspapers, on business channels, on the lips of rivals and admirers alike. To someone like her, his presence here must have felt like an omen. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice sharp now. She gripped her bag tighter. He dropped his hand, let the rain fall over him without resistance. "The napkin," he said simply. "In your pocket." Her face paled. The tired waitress was gone in an instant, replaced by something fierce, almost primal. She clutched the pocket as though he'd threatened her life. "I don't know what you're talking about." Nathaniel took one step closer, his voice urgent but not unkind. "Please. I saw what you were drawing. The concentric strata, the thermal gradients, the phased array annotations. You weren't doodling. You were modeling resonance. You were sketching a closed-loop geothermal system." Her eyes widened. Her lips parted in shock, just for a heartbeat, before she masked it with icy defiance. "You don't know what you're saying." "Yes. I Do. Nathaniel pressed. His voice softened, trembled almost with something raw and real. You weren't just scribbling, Eliza. You've mapped a system that could change everything. Not millions. Billions. Maybe the future itself. Am I wrong? The rain hissed between them, 1,000 drops breaking on the pavement, filling the silence that followed. Eliza's chest rose and fell quickly, her breath visible in the cold night. For the first time since he'd walked into that diner, Nathaniel saw her not as a server, not as a stranger, but as someone standing at the edge of something far bigger than herself, clutching it like a secret too dangerous to share. And though fear shadowed her face, her eyes betrayed something else. Recognition. He had spoken her language, the one she thought no one else could ever understand. "Who are you really?" she whispered, her voice fragile, cracking. Nathaniel stepped closer, his soaked suit clinging to him like a second skin. "I told you, I'm an engineer. And you? You've just drawn a map to the future of energy." The space between them vibrated with tension, with possibility, with the dangerous weight of trust. And for the first time in months, Nathaniel Harrington felt alive. The rain turned the street into a mirror of black glass, each lamp reflected in trembling shards across the pavement. Eliza stood rooted in place, her hand still pressed against the pocket where the folded napkin hid. Her eyes narrowed, studying the man before her, his silver-streaked hair plastered to his forehead, his suit drenched, his breath steaming in the cold night. Everything about him screamed wealth, power, a world she had only glimpsed from the outside. Yet in his eyes, those restless, haunted eyes, she saw something that unsettled her. Not hunger, not arrogance, but desperation. "Please," Nathaniel said, his voice cracking with the weight of something he had not felt in years. 5 minutes, that's all I'm asking. Just sit with me. Let me buy you a real coffee, not what they serve in there. He gestured to the diner, its neon sign flickering late diner into the storm. "No contracts, no tricks, I need to understand what I saw." Her first instinct was to walk away. Every warning bell inside her screamed it. Men with money and charm always wanted something, and it was never good. But then there was the way he had spoken earlier, those precise words, Kelvin Helmholtz instabilities, thermal gradients, phrases she had never heard slip from anyone's lips outside of a university lab. He hadn't guessed. He had understood. Her heart thudded in her chest. What did she really have to lose? A minimum wage job? A drafty apartment? A mountain of bills that grew taller by the week? The only thing she owned outright was her father's legacy, his research, his dream. She had kept it close for years, hidden, guarded, like an ember she couldn't let die. And somehow this man, this fallen titan, had seen it flicker through her napkin sketches. She exhaled, the breath shaky in the damp air. 5 minutes, she said at last, her tone clipped, defensive. Nathaniel's eyes softened with relief. He gestured toward the curb, where the Maybach waited like a patient panther. Its engine purred, headlights cutting sharp beams through the downpour. Frank, the driver, stood silently by the open rear door, his umbrella a futile shield against the storm. Eliza hesitated. Every instinct told her she didn't belong inside a car like that. But curiosity, raw, aching curiosity, pulled her forward. She slid into the back seat, clutching her bag tightly on her lap. The leather smelled rich, warm, impossibly clean compared to the bleach and grease stench of the diner. She felt swallowed by it, cocooned in wealth that only made her more aware of her faded jacket and scuffed shoes. Nathaniel slid in across from her, dripping rain onto the polished floor mats. Frank closed the door and the world outside disappeared. The sound of the storm vanished with it, replaced by a silence so profound it felt sacred. The privacy screen slid up, leaving them in a world of wood paneling, soft leather, and shadows, broken only by the glow of dashboard lights. For a long moment, neither spoke. Eliza's fingers twisted around the strap of her bag, her body tense, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. Nathaniel studied her quietly, his posture not the arrogant sprawl of a man accustomed to power, but the cautious lean of someone afraid to push too hard. "My father," Eliza finally whispered, surprising herself with the words. He was a geologist, Dr. Robert Hayes. He had theories, big ones. Everyone laughed at him, called him a fantasist. Nathaniel leaned forward, his attention absolute. He didn't move, didn't interrupt. "He said we were sipping from the edge of a volcano," she continued, her voice growing, steadier. "When we could be harnessing the star at the center of our own planet." Her eyes flicked up, meeting his. "That's what you saw on the napkin. His cascade model. My refinements of it. Equations I've been working on for years." Nathaniel's pulse quickened. The words cascade model lit his mind like lightning. He nodded slowly, his voice reverent. "Not just drilling to a hot spot, creating one. A feedback loop." She swallowed, hard. "The cascade point," she admitted, almost against her will. "A self-sustaining reaction, if it could be controlled." Her voice broke off, fear and awe mixing in her tone. Nathaniel's eyes burned with something she hadn't expected. Respect. "If it could be controlled," he echoed softly, "it wouldn't just be worth millions, it would be worth everything." In that cocoon of silence, in the warm leather shadowed by rain-soaked windows, a strange electricity crackled between them. For years, Eliza had carried her father's work alone, convinced no one would ever believe in it. And now, here sat a man whose name was carved into the skyline, whose empire stretched across industries, speaking the secret language she thought only she understood. 5 minutes, she had promised, but already she felt the clock shatter, time bending beneath the weight of something neither of them could walk away from. The Maybach hummed softly as it cut through the storm, carrying them nowhere in particular, just circling the city while the world outside blurred into streaks of gray. Inside, though, the silence was alive, thick with a kind of fragile intensity neither of them dared break too quickly. Eliza sat rigid, her bag clutched in her lap like a shield. Nathaniel leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, his gaze locked on her as if the entire world had narrowed to this one tired woman and the folded napkin in her pocket. "Show me," he said at last, his voice low but insistent. "Not because I doubt you, but because I need to see the shape of it in your hands." Eliza hesitated. The instinct to protect what was hers, her father's, ran deep. For years, she had lived with the ache of his dismissal, the humiliation of watching doors slam in his face, funding vanish, colleagues mock. All she had left was his research and her promise to carry it forward. To hand it over now, even to a man like Nathaniel Harrington, felt like a betrayal. And yet, there was something in his eyes. Not greed, not pity, but recognition. Slowly, she drew the napkin out, smoothing it on her lap with careful hands. The pen strokes were a little smudged from her fingers, the paper softened by hours of folding, but the design remained. Concentric circles intersected with precise arcs. Glyph-like notes marked specific points and a spiral carved down through the center, annotated with temperature gradients and pressure figures. To anyone else, it would look like nonsense. To Nathaniel, it was revelation. He leaned closer, his breath quickening. "Yes, God, yes, that's not just thermal mapping. That's resonance targeting. And here." He pointed at a cluster of figures annotated beside the spiral. "That's not a depth marker. That's a stress model. You've built-in feedback. You're not just mapping hot rock, you're shaping it." Eliza nodded, a spark flickering in her tired eyes. "My father called it the cascade point. He believed that under specific conditions you could initiate a chain reaction. Microfractures expanding exponentially, releasing more heat, feeding back into the system. Energy output that multiplies instead of diminishes. One plant could power an entire city." Her voice caught, pride and sorrow tangled together. But he could never solve the control problem. He tried everything, exotic fluids, resonance adjustments, but nothing held. And without control, it was just fantasy. Nathaniel's hand hovered above the napkin, trembling slightly. He wasn't looking at fantasy. He was looking at a blueprint, incomplete but dazzling. His mind raced through the catalog of technologies he had built over the years, tools meant for other purposes, deep space sensor arrays, adaptive AI models, exotic alloys developed for asteroid mining, pieces of puzzles he had abandoned or shelved, now reassembling in his mind with terrifying clarity. "You're wrong about one thing," he said, his voice steady but alive with urgency. "It's not unsolvable. The fluids were the wrong focus. It's a container problem, a material science problem. The cascade can be initiated, but only if the drill head itself can withstand and direct the phased plasma pulse. And that," he looked her straight in the eyes, "is something my company has already done for a completely different application." Eliza blinked, stunned. "You've built plasma-resistant alloys?" "Not for geothermal," he admitted. "For deep space, propulsion. But the properties overlap almost perfectly. Combine that with real-time seismic feedback from adaptive AI sensors, and we could not only initiate the cascade, we could control it. Not chaos, not collapse, stability." The Maybach was silent again, but this time, the quiet wasn't heavy. It was electric. The kind of silence that crackled right before lightning splits the sky. Eliza's chest rose and fell quickly, her hands trembling on the napkin. For years she had been invisible, carrying brilliance in her pocket while serving stale coffee and greasy eggs. And now here was Nathaniel Harrington, a man broken by betrayal but still carrying the instincts of a builder, sketching solutions, in the air with the same excitement she had once seen in her father's eyes. "You realize what this means?" she whispered. Nathaniel leaned back, his soaked suit clinging to him, but his eyes burned with a fire she hadn't expected from a man she thought was finished. "It means your father wasn't a fantasist. It means you're sitting on the holy grail of clean energy. And it means, Eliza Hayes, that if you let me, I will help you build it." For a moment the rain outside seemed to quiet, as though the whole city were holding its breath. A billionaire stripped of his crown and a waitress carrying her father's dream had just glimpsed something vast, something world-shaking, on a flimsy napkin. Eliza's fingers lingered on the napkin as though afraid he might snatch it away. The weight of his words still hung in the air, and for a long, suspended moment she let them echo in her mind. Holy Grail, clean energy. Build it. It sounded impossible, too good, too dangerous. She folded the napkin slowly, carefully, tucking it back into her pocket. Her father's work was not a trophy to display. It was a living wound, one she had carried in silence for years. Every promise ever made to him had ended in betrayal, grants revoked, tenure stripped, colleagues sneering at his daydreams. And now here sat Nathaniel Harrington, a billionaire who could buy and sell the world with a flick of his pen, telling her he wanted to help. Her chest tightened. She wanted to believe him, but she knew better. "Why me?" she asked, her voice steady but sharp like steel wrapped in exhaustion. "You could call MIT tomorrow and hire 100 PhDs. You could walk into any boardroom and pull the best engineers in the world to your side. Why me? A waitress in a diner with nothing but a napkin in her pocket?" Her question cut deeper than she realized. Nathaniel didn't flinch, but inside it landed like a blade. He leaned back, rainwater dripping from his sleeve onto the polished leather, his face shadowed in the dim cabin light. "Because I've already tried that," he said quietly. "I've filled buildings with PhDs. I've built empires on credentials and resumes. And do you know what I found?" He looked up, his eyes meeting hers, raw and unguarded. "They work. They perform. But they don't burn. They don't ache for it. They don't carry obsession the way you do. What I saw on that napkin, those weren't idle sketches. That was years of thought pouring out of someone who couldn't stop even if she tried. That's not something you can hire. That's not something money buys." Eliza's lips pressed into a thin line. His words were flattering, but flattery was a currency she distrusted more than money. "And what happens when you get what you want? When the schematics are yours, when the patents are filed, when the labs hum with machines that came from my father's work? What happens to me then?" Nathaniel's throat tightened. The image of Gideon Vance rose in his mind like a specter. Once, his protege. Now his executioner. He thought of the knife buried in his back, of the headlines, of the endless nights spent staring out at a city that had once bowed to him and now whispered about his downfall. He forced himself to breathe. "That's not who I am anymore," he said, and for once it didn't sound like a performance. It sounded like confession. "I've spent the last 6 months surrounded by lawyers and accountants, managing lawsuits, counting money, watching what I built rot from the inside. Do you know what that feels like? To realize that everything you thought mattered was ash?" His voice broke on the last word. He steadied himself, his jaw hardening. "That napkin, it was the first thing in months that made me feel like an engineer again. Not a CEO, not a brand, a builder. I don't just need your idea, Eliza. I need your spark, and I am not going to steal that from you. I'm asking to stand beside it." The cabin grew quiet. The storm outside pressed against the glass, a low roar like the world reminding them how small they were. Eliza studied him, her expression unreadable, though her hand had loosened slightly from her pocket. Nathaniel leaned closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "I'll prove it to you. My personal lawyers, not the companies, will draw up an agreement. You'll have control, not me. A majority stake if you want it. Independent counsel of your choosing, all paid for by me. And if you walk away, you keep everything, your choice, your freedom, your father's legacy untouched." Her breath caught. She had expected arrogance, manipulation, the casual dismissal of a man used to getting his way. What she hadn't expected was this: a billionaire who looked more like a drowning man clutching at her hand, not for power, but for purpose. Still, doubt clung to her. She had built her life around suspicion, and suspicion didn't let go easily. "You say all of this now?" she murmured, her voice trembling against her will. "But when the stakes get higher, when the money gets bigger, will you still mean it?" Nathaniel's gaze didn't waver. "I've already lost everything that mattered once. I'm not about to do it again." The silence between them shifted, no longer sharp but heavy with something neither could yet name. Eliza turned to the rain-streaked window, her reflection ghosted against the skyline beyond. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of a possibility so large it frightened her, and beside her sat a man who had nothing left to lose, and perhaps everything to prove. The Maybach slowed to a crawl along the wet streets, but neither of them noticed. Eliza's fingers tapped nervously against her bag, as if her body was trying to remind her she still had an escape route. Nathaniel sat forward, his damp suit clinging, eyes lit with an energy he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in months, the fog of betrayal had lifted, replaced with the wild rush of possibility. "Eliza," he said carefully, "you've told me the theory, but theories alone aren't enough. Somewhere in your father's work there must be more. Notes, data, models." Her hand tightened on the strap of her bag. She hesitated, then drew out an old, scarred external hard drive. The casing was dented, its label worn away, but it had weight in her hand. She cradled it like it was more fragile than bone. "This," she whispered. "It has everything. Decades of data, every seismic reading he collected, every equation, every attempt. But there's a master file, his final theory. I've never been able to open it. He locked it down so tightly even I couldn't get through." Nathaniel's eyes sharpened. "Encrypted?" "Yes." He was paranoid at the end. Said people were circling him trying to steal his work. He told me if anyone ever tried to force it open, they'd destroy the heart of it. I've tried every password I could think of. Nothing. Nathaniel reached out carefully as if asking permission before touching it. "May I?" Eliza studied him for a long moment, searching for even the faintest trace of manipulation in his face. All she saw was the same thing she carried herself: obsession. Finally, she handed the drive over. "Frank," Nathaniel called softly. The privacy screen slid down and the driver glanced back. "Take us to the tower." Frank gave a small nod. No address was needed. Within minutes, the Maybach was gliding through the storm, climbing toward Harrington Innovations Tower, the steel and glass monolith that still bore Nathaniel's name like a scar across the skyline. They entered through a private elevator that bypassed the glittering lobby, rising straight to the top. When the doors slid open, Eliza's breath caught. It wasn't an office. It was a cathedral. The space stretched wide and high, one wall made entirely of glass that looked down on Seattle like the view of a god. The rest was alive with machines, holographic, displays hovering mid-air, robotic arms sliding along ceiling tracks, massive 3D printers humming in a corner, whiteboards scrawled with equations in overlapping colors. The air pulsed with power, with creation, with the hum of computational engines working at incomprehensible speeds. Nathaniel watched her face as she stepped inside, her fatigue momentarily erased by wonder. "Welcome to my sanctuary," he said, quietly. "This is where I still get my hands dirty." He plugged the drive into a terminal. The screens lit up instantly, scrolling with directories and encrypted folders. The master file sat at the top, glowing like a forbidden fruit. Project Prometheus Final. Nathaniel's fingers flew across the keys, summoning decryption programs, testing algorithms. Eliza hovered beside him, her heart pounding. But each attempt failed, the system responding with icy rejection. "Access denied." "Access denied. Your father was brilliant," Nathaniel muttered. "This isn't just encryption, it's layered, personal." Eliza's brow furrowed. She thought of him at the end, muttering poetry under his breath, humming old songs, scribbling notes in the margins of napkins. Her breath caught. "Wait." She pulled the napkin from her pocket and spread it across the desk. Nathaniel frowned. "We've already seen the schematic." "No." She pointed at the margins, at the seemingly random scratches she had ignored before. Letters, numbers, a snatch of music notation, a phrase half-written. "It's a cipher," she whispered. He built the key into everything, his poems, his songs, his favorite lines hidden in plain sight. They pieced it together slowly, her fingers trembling as she traced Frost's "The Road Not Taken," matching it to the code scribbled near the spiral. A sequence of notes matched to a Bach cantata he adored. And finally, a string of coordinates, a place only he would have chosen. She typed it in. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then the screen went black and a single word appeared. "Access granted." The file bloomed open. Equations poured across the holographic screens. Maps of the Earth's crust layered with stress models, heat signatures, predictive cascade models more advanced than anything she had dared imagine. Her father's life's work. Unlocked at last. Eliza pressed a hand to her mouth, tears stinging her eyes. "He wasn't crazy," she whispered. "He was right." Nathaniel scrolled through the introduction, but as his eyes moved lower, his breath hitched. A line in the acknowledgments froze him in place. "Special thanks to my then protege, Gideon Vance, whose early work in corporate applications, while ultimately divergent from the project's ethos, provided a valuable perspective." The name hit Nathaniel like a blow. His jaw clenched, his chest tightening with fury and disbelief. Gideon. His Gideon. Eliza's eyes widened as she read the name aloud. Gideon Vance. The same man who— "Yes," Nathaniel said, his voice low and dangerous, staring at the glass wall as if the city itself mocked him. "The same man who betrayed me." The storm outside cracked with thunder, rattling the glass as though the world itself understood what they had just uncovered. This wasn't just research. This was a legacy stolen, corrupted, and now resurrected. And the man who had tried to bury them both had his fingerprints in its very beginning. Nathaniel turned back to Eliza, his eyes hard, alive with fury and fire. "Now I know what he's after, and we're not going to let him have it." The night they cracked her father's code, Nathaniel barely slept. He stood at the glass wall of his tower, staring down at a city drowned in rain, his reflection a ghost laid over the lights. Eliza's father had been right. The cascade model wasn't fantasy, it was a revolution waiting to be built. But Gideon's name burned on the screen like a scar that refused to heal. His betrayal was no longer just corporate theft. It was personal, stretching back a decade, its roots tangled in both their lives. By morning, Nathaniel had made a decision. They couldn't stay here. Harrington Innovations Tower, Once the fortress of his empire was now compromised. Gideon had walked these halls, memorized its rhythms, seeded his backdoors in its systems. Every camera, every server, every supply chain could already be his. If they tried to build here, Gideon would gut them before they ever took their first breath. "We go dark," Nathaniel told Eliza, his voice hard with clarity. "No announcements, no paper trail. From now on, we disappear." Within 48 hours, they had a new base. An abandoned aerospace fabrication plant, decommissioned years ago, hidden in the industrial sprawl south of Seattle. On the surface, it was a husk, rusted hangar doors, broken windows, a shell, swallowed by weeds. But deep inside, Nathaniel's people had stripped it clean and rebuilt it into something else. A secret war room, a place for reinvention. Eliza stood in the cavernous space for the first time, her breath catching. It wasn't glamorous like the tower, but it pulsed with potential. The echoes of her footsteps against the concrete floor felt like the heartbeat of something new. Nathaniel called them the Helios Initiative, a name chosen deliberately. Prometheus stole fire, but Helios carried the sun itself. They would not steal. They would build. Their team was small, just 5 engineers Nathaniel trusted with his life. People who had worked beside him for years, who had turned down higher salaries elsewhere because they believed in him. He brought them in one by one, swearing them to secrecy, their phones confiscated, their connections severed. They weren't told everything at first, only that they were working on a skunkworks project, one that could change the energy sector forever. Eliza, once a waitress serving stale coffee, now stood at the head of the room as chief science officer. At first, the engineers eyed her curiously, skeptical of the young woman with dark circles under her eyes and calluses from diner work. But that changed quickly. When she sketched equations across the whiteboards, when she solved mechanical bottlenecks they had wrestled with for weeks, when her intuitive grasp of physics sliced through problems like a blade, skepticism turned to awe. She was no mascot. She was the mind guiding the ship. The napkin sketch, once fragile and smudged, became their blueprint. Her father's hard drive became their scripture. Every night, Eliza pored over his notes, translating theory into engineering, shaping dreams into specifications. And every morning Nathaniel handled what she could not: funding, procurement, the careful ballet of lies and misdirection to keep Gideon's eyes fixed elsewhere. But Gideon wasn't a fool. The first attacks came quietly. A key supplier of tungsten carbide composites suddenly announced a 6-month delay. A specialty cooling system they had ordered from Germany was rerouted at customs. Nathaniel's contacts confirmed the truth. Apex Dynamics, Gideon's new empire, had locked down the suppliers. "If we can't buy it," Nathaniel growled, "we'll make it." Within a week, a $20 million metallurgical 3D printer was flown in under a shell company. The engineers gasped as it arrived, a gleaming machine more advanced than anything they had ever touched. Within days, they were fabricating their own alloys, stronger, cleaner, faster. Every attempt Gideon made to starve them only sharpened their resolve. Then came the cyber attacks. Sophisticated phishing schemes targeted their engineers. One young programmer, Ben, nearly clicked on an email disguised as a family message. Nathaniel's security protocols caught it just in time. But the message was clear. Gideon knew they were building something. He just didn't know what, or how close they were. Paranoia became part of life. Phones locked away in lead-lined cabinets. Communication reduced to face-to-face. Every new part sourced through tangled webs of companies so no one could piece the puzzle together. They lived under a constant shadow, the fear of discovery gnawing at their sleep. For Eliza, it was worse. She had dreams, nightmares really, of Gideon walking into the warehouse, smiling, plucking her father's hard drive from her hands. She would wake drenched in sweat, clutching the notebook she now carried everywhere. Nathaniel found her one night alone in the vault, her shoulders shaking, her face hidden in her hands. "He'll never get it," Nathaniel told her firmly, kneeling beside her. His voice was steadier than he felt, but he needed her to believe it. Not while I'm breathing. The promise lit something in her, even if it didn't erase the fear. And so they pressed on. In the echoing warehouse, beneath fluorescent lights that buzzed like watchful eyes, the Prometheus drill began to take shape. 10 feet of gleaming dark alloy, veins of conduits laced through its body, emitters bristling like the spines of some alien weapon. It didn't look like a drill. It looked like destiny. But as the machine neared completion, Nathaniel knew the truth. Gideon wasn't waiting. He was circling, watching, testing their defenses. And when he finally struck, he wouldn't strike with contracts or lawsuits. He would strike to kill their dream outright. Nathaniel tightened his jaw as he stared at the half-assembled drill glowing under the work lights. "We build fast," he muttered to himself. "We build quiet. And when the moment comes, we'll be ready." The warehouse smelled of oil and ozone, the air sharp with the tang of burning circuits as the engineers pushed the Prometheus drill closer to life. Nights bled into mornings with no one noticing. Coffee cups multiplied, empty food containers piled in corners, and the hum of machinery became the lullaby that carried them through exhaustion. Every day, Eliza felt the weight of what they were building pressing harder on her chest. Every day, she saw Gideon's shadow in her mind, smiling like a predator circling unseen. That shadow took form one night when she was alone in the vault. The others had gone home for a few hours of sleep. Nathaniel was in the fabrication wing, arguing with a supplier over secure delivery of sensor arrays. Eliza sat hunched at the terminal, combing through her father's notes. Equations blurred. In her vision, fatigue gnawing at her, but she refused to stop. She couldn't. Not when they were this close. Her burner phone vibrated against the desk. She frowned. Hardly anyone had this number. Only the team, Nathaniel, and the hospital handling Sophie's care. She picked it up, heart tightening. "Eliza Hayes," a smooth voice answered, low and confident, like someone who knew he was already in control. "You don't know me, but I know you." Her spine stiffened instantly. "Who is this?" "I think you already know." A pause, then, almost amused. "Finding things is what I do. And you, Eliza, are very hard to miss when you're hiding in a glass tower or a forgotten warehouse." Her blood went cold. "Gideon," she whispered. "Good," he said, as though they were old acquaintances catching up. "I wanted to hear you say my name." Eliza's hand tightened on the phone. "How did you get this number?" Gideon chuckled softly. "Numbers are easy. What's harder is finding people who matter. And you, Eliza, you matter." His tone, sharpened with mock admiration. "I've seen your little project, partnering with a fallen king like Nathaniel Harrington. Clever, risky, but clever." Fear gripped her throat, but she forced steel into her voice. "What do you want?" "The same thing you want," Gideon said simply. "Your father's work." "You think I don't know about Robert Hayes?" "I do. Brilliant man. Tragically naive. He thought his gift should belong to the world, free and uncontrolled. That kind of thinking gets people hurt." Her pulse hammered. "It was never yours. And it will never be yours. Not the way you want it," he replied smoothly. "This is bigger than you, Eliza. Bigger than Harrington. If you fight me, you'll lose. But if you work with me," his voice softened as if offering a hand, "I'll give you everything you've ever wanted. $10 million wired tomorrow. Enough to care for your sister. Enough to erase your debts. All I ask is that you hand over the research, clean, complete, and walk away." Her breath shook, fury and fear warring inside her. "It's not for sale." Silence on the other end, then a quiet laugh, the kind that chilled more than any threat. "You sound like your father. And look where it got him. Sick, broke, forgotten." He let the words hang, twisting the knife. "Don't make the same mistake. Harrington can't protect you. He's sentimental, bound by ideas of loyalty and ethics. Me? I don't suffer from those weaknesses." Her throat tightened, but her words came out steady, sharp as glass. You'll never get it, not from me. Gideon's voice dropped low and final. You're making a mistake. I will get that research, Eliza. One way or another. Think about my offer. It's the last one you'll ever hear. The line went dead. Her hand trembled as she lowered the phone, bile rising in her throat. She couldn't breathe. The vault suddenly felt too small, the shadows too heavy. She staggered out into the main floor, clutching the phone like it was poisoned. Nathaniel found her minutes later, pale, shaking, her eyes wide with fear. She told him everything, the voice, the offer, the threat. Nathaniel listened in silence, his jaw tightening, his eyes narrowing to slits. When she finished, his voice was low, steady, and full of cold fire. He's overplayed his hand. Eliza stared at him. What if he's right? What if you can't protect me? Nathaniel stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. Then we'd turn his arrogance into our advantage. He thinks my ethics are a weakness, but we'll make them our strength. Something in his tone settled the storm, in her chest. For the first time since the call, her lungs loosened, her heart steadied. She nodded slowly, swallowing hard. And in that moment, the Helios Initiative was no longer just a secret project. It was a battlefield. And Gideon had just declared war. The warehouse was alive with purpose. Sparks crackled from welding torches, machines hummed as alloys were shaped, and the air was thick with the scent of steel and sweat. For weeks, every moment had been building toward this, the birth of the Prometheus drill. It stood at the center of the cavernous floor like some strange monument, 10 feet of gleaming alloy laced with conduits and emitters that shimmered faintly in the harsh light. To the untrained eye, it looked alien, more weapon than machine, but to Eliza it was beautiful. It was the embodiment of her father's equations, her refinements, Nathaniel's resources, and the team's relentless ingenuity. It was a dream given form. She stood before it, her hand lightly grazing the cool surface. A lump rose in her throat. He would have called it madness, she whispered, half to herself. And then he would have loved it. Nathaniel approached, his eyes drinking in the machine with the reverence of a man who had spent his life building empires out of ideas. His hand brushed against hers briefly on the alloy. No, he said softly. He wouldn't have called it madness. He would have called it inevitable. The engineers gathered around, exhaustion etched into their faces, but their eyes wide with awe. For weeks they had worked under secrecy, under pressure, under the threat of sabotage. But here it was, the culmination of sleepless nights and unshakable will. Ben, the youngest of them, broke the silence with a grin. Looks like it could eat through the planet itself. It could, Eliza said, her voice steady, though her chest fluttered with fear and pride. That's why control matters. Control. That word haunted every moment. It wasn't enough to build it, they had to tame it. They had to ensure the cascade would be stable, not a burst of chaos that would consume them all. Every calculation, every sensor array, every line of code came down to that. Nathaniel turned to Ben. Run the diagnostic one more time. Every circuit, every protocol. I don't want a single ghost in that machine. Ben nodded, sliding into the terminal, fingers flying across the keys. The screens lit up with scrolling code, green lines pouring down like rain. The hum of servers filled the vault. Everyone watched in silence. Minutes passed. Then Ben froze. His hands stilled. The color drained from his face. Boss, he said quietly, we've got a problem. Nathaniel was beside him in an instant. What kind of problem? Ben's voice shook. Not software, hardware. It's embedded in the processor chip. A logic bomb. The words cut through the room like a blade. Eliza's stomach knotted. Explain, she demanded. Ben pointed at the code highlighted on the screen. It's dormant, buried so deep no normal scan would ever catch it. It activates only under very specific conditions. When the drill reaches cascade parameters, then it bypasses every safety protocol. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. And then what? Ben swallowed hard. Instead of creating a controlled cascade, It would trigger a full plasma discharge, all at once. No regulation, no fail-safes. The drill would vaporize itself, and everything in half a mile. A chill swept the room. The engineers exchanged horrified glances. Eliza's hand flew to her mouth. "That's not just sabotage," she whispered. "That's a bomb." Ben nodded grimly. "And it was planted before we even touched the chip. This isn't an accident. Someone knew exactly what we'd build and made sure it would destroy itself the moment we succeeded." The name hung in the silence without anyone saying it. Gideon. Eliza's knees felt weak. She gripped the edge of the console, forcing herself to breathe. All the nights she had spent bent over equations, all the risks they had taken, it had been waiting to end in a crater. Nathaniel's face was stone. Fury coiled behind his eyes, but his voice was cold and sharp. "He doesn't want to beat us, he wants to bury us. He wants the world to think it was impossible, that it killed us before it ever lived." The team stood frozen, the weight of betrayal pressing down on them. Eliza looked at Nathaniel, her voice breaking. "What do we do? If we replace the chip, he'll know we found it. He'll know we're still alive." Nathaniel's eyes burned as he stared at the glowing drill. "Then we don't replace it," he said, his voice low, dangerous. "We hijack it." Eliza blinked. "What?" "We let his trap spring," Nathaniel continued, his tone ironclad. "But when it does, we seize control. Redirect the discharge. Turn his bomb into our weapon. He'll be watching, waiting for us to die. Instead, we'll show him what it means to steal fire from the gods." The warehouse fell silent again, but this time it wasn't fear that gripped them. It was resolve. Eliza drew a shaky breath, her eyes locking on Nathaniel's. He looked like a man reborn. Not the hollowed-out billionaire who had walked into a diner searching for bad coffee, but the builder, the innovator, the leader who had once stared down the impossible and made it real. "Then we move fast," she said, her voice steadier now, "before he realizes we're onto him." Nathaniel nodded, his gaze fixed on the Prometheus drill, gleaming like a blade waiting to be unsheathed. "We finish this. On our terms." The convoy rolled into the Nevada desert under the cover of night, headlights slicing across a barren sea of salt and stone. The landscape stretched forever, flat and merciless, a place where silence had its own gravity. To Nathaniel, it was the perfect place for either a miracle or a grave. The Prometheus drill rode in the belly of a reinforced transport truck, its alloy shell gleaming under dim work lights, as if it already knew it was destined for legend. The team followed in a mobile command center, a converted trailer packed with servers, monitors, and humming generators. Private security fanned out in the low hills. Black SUVs crouched like predators in the dark. Eliza pressed her forehead to the cool glass of the command center's window. The night was endless, the stars sharp and cruel above. Her chest was tight with fear and awe. This was it. The moment her father had dreamed of. The moment she had carried in secret all her life. And yet, laced in every heartbeat was Gideon's threat, coiled like a snake at the back of her mind. He would be out there somewhere, watching, waiting. Nathaniel entered, the desert wind trailing dust across his shoulders. His face was set, unreadable, but his eyes burned with a fierce light. He scanned the room, the engineers hunched over their stations, Ben at the terminal with fingers hovering, ready to intercept the trap they knew lay waiting in the heart of their machine. "Final checks," Nathaniel said, his voice steady but sharp. "I want every protocol triple confirmed." The drill was lowered into the borehole, its metallic body swallowed by the earth. Cables snaked across the desert floor, feeding it power from the generators. On the main screen, depth markers began to climb, numbers flashing red as the machine chewed deeper into the crust. 2 kilometers, one engineer called. 3, another echoed, her voice tight with awe. Eliza's eyes locked on the graphs. Heat and pressure readings climbed in perfect rhythm, her father's equations unfolding in real time. This was it. The cascade point was near. "Temperature approaching threshold," Ben announced, sweat beading on his brow. His voice quivered. "It's coming. The logic bomb is waking up." The air in the command center thickened. Every monitor lit with alarms as the processor chip began feeding unauthorized commands into the system. Safety protocols blinked red, bypassed, overwritten. The drill screamed in protest as it neared the cascade conditions. "It's happening," Ben shouted. "If I don't stop it now, the discharge will—" "Not stop it," Nathaniel barked. "Hijack it now!" Ben slammed the keys. The counter code Eliza had worked on for days surged into the system, grappling with Gideon's trap like two predators locked in combat. The lights flickered. The ground shuddered beneath them. For a terrifying second, the drill's energy output spiked off the charts, climbing into the zone of catastrophe. "Redirecting?" Ben yelled, his voice cracking. "Patch engaged!" The monitors went white. A deep, resonant thrum rippled through the desert floor, a sound more felt than heard. Eliza clutched the edge of the console as the ground vibrated under her feet. Then, silence. The main screen steadied, the graphs leveled, energy output smoothed into a perfect, controlled plateau. "We have Cascade," Eliza whispered, tears filling her eyes. "It's holding. It's stable. Oh my God, it's working." The room erupted in cheers, relief and triumph, bursting like floodgates. Nathaniel allowed himself a breath, a smile tugging at the edge of his lips. He turned to Eliza, her face illuminated by the glow of data that confirmed the impossible. For a moment, the years of betrayal, of loss, of despair, none of it mattered. They had done it. But miles away, hidden in a rocky alcove, Gideon Vance sat in his own mobile command post, a glass of champagne in hand. His monitors had been filled with graphs showing Prometheus spiking out of control. He leaned back, smiling coldly, waiting for the explosion that would erase Nathaniel and his team in fire. And then, one by one, every screen went black. The lights chirped. The generators coughed and went silent. His phone, his radios, even his men's weapons, all dead. Fried in an instant. Gideon stood, rage flooding his face. What the hell just happened? Outside, the rumble of engines grew. Black SUVs crested the ridge, headlights cutting across his camp. Armed men poured out, surrounding his position. Back in the Helios command center, Nathaniel picked up the secure radio. "Marion, are you on?" His lawyer's crisp voice answered. Loud and clear. "FAA has confirmed multiple unregistered aircraft just dropped from radar, Gideon's most likely. And we have a clear recording of his little offer to Eliza, coupled with his armed presence at a Department of Energy test site. I believe we can call this checkmate." Nathaniel's lips curved into a grim smile. He turned to Eliza, who stood trembling, her hands pressed over her mouth, tears streaking her face. Her father's dream had survived. Their machine had lived. Gideon's empire was collapsing in the silence of a desert night. Nathaniel touched her shoulder, steadying her. "It's only the beginning," he said. And for the first time in years, she believed it. The desert was silent by dawn, broken only by the distant hum of engines carrying Gideon Vance and his mercenaries into custody. The night had ended not with an explosion, but with a quiet triumph that felt almost unreal. Nathaniel and Eliza stood outside the command center as the first rays of sunlight stretched across the horizon, painting the salt flats in molten gold. For the first time since her father's death, Eliza felt the weight in her chest lift. Not gone, but lighter, as if she had finally set something down after carrying it too long. By the time they returned to Seattle, the fallout had already begun. News outlets blared with headlines. Apex Dynamics executives arrested in federal sweep. The charges stacked against Gideon were staggering. Corporate espionage, cyber terrorism, conspiracy, attempted sabotage of a Department of Energy site. And Marion Shaw, Nathaniel's lawyer, had orchestrated it flawlessly. Every scrap of evidence, Gideon's threats to Eliza, the sabotage hidden in the chip, the recordings of his mercenaries approaching the test site, was placed neatly into federal hands. There was no wiggle room, no denial that could save him. The trading floor, Apex stock plummeted in real time. By the end of the week, what had once been a towering rival was gutted, investors fleeing, its assets frozen under investigation. Gideon's empire didn't collapse with a bang. It bled out in silence, stripped piece by piece by the very system he had tried to manipulate. For Nathaniel, it should have felt like vengeance, a clean knife finally drawn across the wound Gideon had left. But when he saw his former protege on the news, handcuffed and scowling as cameras flashed, the victory felt different. Not sweet, not satisfying, just inevitable. Gideon had always believed in control through fear, through ruthlessness, and in the end that same arrogance had left him exposed. Eliza, watching beside Nathaniel, whispered, "He thought you couldn't protect me." Nathaniel's eyes stayed fixed on the screen, his voice low. He thought wrong. Yet as the world feasted on Gideon's downfall, the true victory remained hidden. No one outside their team knew what had really been built in the Nevada desert. The Prometheus drill, the Cascade model, the spark her father had dreamed into existence, all of it remained cloaked in secrecy. The official story, carefully fed to the press, was that Harrington Innovations had thwarted a hostile sabotage attempt on an experimental geological survey project. A neat cover, a smokescreen. The truth was far too valuable to reveal. Not yet. The weeks that followed, the warehouse transformed. What had once been a shadow operation became a burgeoning headquarters. More engineers were brought in, handpicked and vetted, each sworn into silence under ironclad contracts. The Helios initiative, once 5 people huddled around smuggled equipment, grew into a company with the pulse of something unstoppable. Eliza found herself at the center of it all. One day she was serving coffee in a diner. The next she was addressing rooms full of the brightest minds in engineering. They listened when she spoke. They scribbled down her insights. They deferred to her as chief science officer. It was dizzying, humbling, and terrifying all at once. But she wore it with a quiet pride, knowing every equation she solved carried her father's name with it. Nathaniel, too, had changed. He stepped back from Harrington Innovations, placing the day-to-day operations into the hands of a trusted, new CEO. He no longer wanted to manage an empire built on logistics and AI contracts. His fire had returned, and it burned only for Helios, for building, for creating, for the joy of chasing the impossible. One autumn afternoon, as the rains returned to Seattle, Nathaniel found Eliza on the observation deck of the newly leased Helios Tower, a glass spire not far from the old diner where they had first met. She stood alone, gazing down at the city, her reflection shimmering faintly on the window. "A year ago," she said softly without turning, "I was calculating how many tips it would take to cover my sister's medication. I thought that was all life would ever be." Nathaniel stepped beside her, his hands tucked in his coat pockets. "And now?" Eliza smiled faintly. "Now, we're building something that could change the world." He looked at her then. Really, looked, and for a moment the weight of everything, the betrayal, the fight, the fear, melted away. All that remained was the spark he had seen that night on a napkin. The spark that had saved them both. In the distance, cranes worked furiously on the first Helios power plant rising from the Nevada desert, a facility that, in 5 years, would light a third of Seattle. In 10 years, cities across the globe. And maybe, in a lifetime, a planet no longer bound by oil, coal, or fear. For Nathaniel Harrington, it was redemption. For Eliza Hayes, it was vindication. For both, it was only the beginning. The morning sky over Seattle was pale gold, washed clean after a night of hard rain. From the top floor of the Helios Tower, the city stretched out like a living map, streets glittering, ferries crossing the Sound, the skyline crowned with a promise of something new. Nathaniel Harrington stood at the glass, hands folded behind his back. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the gnaw of regret or the sting of betrayal. Instead, he felt something rarer, steadier, peace. Behind him, the sound of laughter, carried, light, unrestrained. Eliza's sister Sophie sat at a long table covered in papers and drawings, working on a puzzle while humming to herself. Doctors had said remission was possible but fragile. Thanks to the trust Nathaniel had arranged, her care was now the best in the country. She was thriving, her cheeks flushed with health instead of pale with sickness. Eliza hovered near her, papers in hand, though her eyes often drifted to Nathaniel. She wasn't the weary waitress he had first seen in the diner. She carried herself differently now, confident, deliberate, her posture marked by the weight of responsibility, but also by a new steadiness. She had stepped into her father's shadow and emerged into her own light. On the far side of the room, holographic models rotated slowly in the air, projections of Helios plants under construction in Nevada, Germany, and Japan. Energy graphs pulsed beside them, lines climbing ever higher. What had begun as a sketch on a napkin was now reshaping entire nations. The boardrooms of oil giants muttered in panic. Politicians whispered about energy independence. Universities taught new courses on cascade point modeling. Nathaniel turned from the window and crossed the room. "You'll be speaking at Stanford next week," he said to Eliza, setting a fresh report on the table. She looked up, brows furrowing. "Stanford? Why me?" "Because they don't need to hear from me," he said firmly. "They need to hear from the person who solved the unsolvable. You've earned that stage." She shook her head, almost shyly, but there was a glimmer of pride she couldn't hide. "I'll never get used to this," she murmured. "You don't have to," Nathaniel replied. "You just have to remember it started with your father, and with you." Eliza's gaze softened. She reached into her bag and pulled out the same napkin, edges now yellowed, lines faded but still legible. She placed it gently on the table between them. "It started here," she said quietly. Nathaniel looked at it, the fragile scrap of paper that had reignited his life. He remembered the night in the diner, the rain on the glass, the taste of bitter coffee, the sight of a weary young woman, scribbling worlds into being when no one was watching. He touched the napkin reverently. "Strange," he said. "All my life I thought ideas had to be born in boardrooms, backed by billions, polished by experts. And then I found the future scribbled in ink on a piece of paper meant to wipe up spills." Eliza smiled faintly, tears brimming in her eyes. "Genius doesn't care where it's born. It just needs someone to believe in it." Sophie looked up from her puzzle, curious. "What's that?" she asked, pointing at the napkin. Eliza exchanged a glance with Nathaniel, then lifted her sister onto her lap. "This," she said, her voice warm, "is the beginning of everything." The three of them sat there for a moment, billionaire, waitress turned scientist, and the little sister whose future was no longer clouded with fear, bound together by a piece of paper and a dream that had survived betrayal, sabotage, and the weight of doubt. Outside, the sun broke through the last of the storm clouds, spilling light across the city. It caught on the glass of the Helios tower, turning it into a beacon visible for miles. Nathaniel glanced at Eliza, at Sophie, at the napkin that had changed everything. "It's a new dawn," he said softly, and for the first time, all three of them believed it.